We'll turn it over to Jonathan from EntryPoint, who has agreed to host today's webcast for us.
Thanks, Holly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today for this ASUG webinar. Today we'll be covering the process and system functionality for maintaining and managing multiple free trade agreements in SAP Global Trade Services. My name is Jonathan Heinonen, and I'm a Senior Consultant Global Trade at EntryPoint Consulting, and I'll be conducting today's webinar. For the agenda for today's call, I wanted to go over a few items, and just as a note, this was a presentation that was originally scheduled to be delivered at the ASUG Fall Focus, so it's now being delivered as a webinar due to we weren't able to present at that time due to other conflicts. Some of the items that we would like to cover today are just first an introduction about who is EntryPoint, second an overview of preference functionality and GTS. Third, some general improvements that have come with GTS 10 and 10.0 and 10.1 for the process for maintaining multiple free trade agreements in GTS and the new functionality that supports that. How the methods of preference determination take into account multiple free trade agreements now. A little about the web user interfaces that allow vendors to maintain long-term vendor declarations. This is some new functionality that is now available that can help your users or your supplier base to help you manage your preference determination. We'll also go through a business case where we show kind of how the preference determination will work on a given product for two free trade agreements. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussions at the end. So first, as an introduction to who we are, I'm with EntryPoint Consulting. We're an SAP partner, so we're a SAP solutions provider and system integrator since 2003. We're also a software reseller and gold-level partner for SAP. And the services we provide are management and process improvement consulting, full lifecycle SAP solution implementations, and hosting and managed services. We're a focused solution provider. We're an all-in-one ERP solution, so we can provide ECC solutions pre-configured by industry vertical. We also specialize in global trade services implementations and upgrades. We also involved in different projects involving extended warehouse management, CRM, environmental health and safety management, and supply chain management. EntryPoint's GTS practice is SAP's longest-standing GTS consulting partner. Our practice is known for its distinctive approach to consulting, which includes some of the following. So when you hire EntryPoint Consulting, you're getting technical consultants, but also trade experts. The value that we bring when you hire EntryPoint is that you get a combined value of subject matter expertise in the area of logistics and trade compliance, but you also get skilled experience in SAP Global Trade Services configuration and functionality. You're also hiring a whole team, so while you may have a single consultant on a project, you get the knowledge of an entire team, so you get the benefit of the depth of our experience and the breadth as well. The methodology and wisdom, so we hire experienced consultants and you get the best practices from over 100 GTS projects. Knowledge sharing, so before you hire a consultant, you can get educated about our approach and our knowledge through our blog at entrypointconsulting.com, as well as through social media updates on LinkedIn or other venues, and frequent webinars such as this and conference presentations. We also put the G in GTS. We've done over 100 implementations, deployed in over 40 countries for over 61 client companies. And we provide the best practice deployments of aerospace and defense ITAR solutions. We've been specifically commended by the State Department in that area. We've also been involved in US and EU encryption solutions, OGA import controls such as FDA or consumer product safety, single solution SPL design. We've hooked up to non-SAP theater systems and to multi-instance environments. And we also have specific solutions in the area of miscellaneous shipments and as well as user-configured export forms or our Flex Form solution. Now to get into the preference processing, I just wanted to start first with this slide. So by now you've probably seen a lot of slides such as this if you've been investigating how GTS manages free trade agreements like NAFTA and EU, and some people have called this the preference wheel. The purpose of today's presentation is not to demonstrate this functionality of the preference wheel at its basic form, but to show you the enhancements SAP has made to the menus and programs that support various segments of this wheel, as they relate to supporting multiple free trade agreements. So we're only focusing on what is new in GTS 10.0 and 10.1. If you need a more basic step-by-step presentation of how GTS preference functionality works, please contact us and we can arrange something in the near future. So to look at this wheel, just a level set before we continue on the presentation, our preference functionality will start with, if you're dealing with procured items, you can request and done for vendor declaration. So this is where you go to your supplier base and you ask what the NAFTA or CAFTA status of a particular item is. And once you get those responses back, then you proceed on to maintenance and aggregation. And we'll get into a little bit about what that means in relation to multiple free trade agreements. But basically, this is, log in your responses and ensuring that you've got enough, you've got preference responses from all the applicable suppliers to establish your preference status for that procured item. And then we would evaluate the preference results. So if those procured items are used in a manufacturing of an end item, this is where we would run preference determination on a bill of material to determine whether that product is qualified for NAFTA or another free trade agreement, and then we would print and issue those vendor or customer certificates. So some of the things that are new in 10.0 and 10.1 in terms of preference are the appearance of the user interface. So the GTS menu path has changed in 10.0 and 10.1, where before preference processing was a single area in the risk management module. Now it's two. So now you have preference and preference processing and preference processing master data. And this is a logical separation of the master data from the transactional elements. You'll also see within those areas that the layout's changed. We'll get to that further in the presentation. We also have closer ties between the process relevant data and the underlying master data. So as we've see that separation now, the process relevant data in terms of the vendor declarations is specifically called out in particular areas, as well as the underlying master data to support that qualifications, such as procurement indicators or other factors are separated out and called out in the preference menu area. We're able, along with this, is the support of multiple preference agreements. So you'll see how the layout impacts the multiple preference agreements. There's additional methods of preference determination, which goes along with the support of multiple preference agreements. As we all probably know, not all preference agreements are the same, so you can have varied rules and methods by preference agreement, as well as a new web user interface for entering long-term vendor declarations, and we'll highlight some of that functionality as we go through. For those of you using GTS 8.0, you'll probably recognize this screen in the upper left. And this is the old model for preference determination in GTS, and it was hard-coded to limit the functionality to only the EU and NAFTA preference agreements. The change in layout starting in 10.0 goes along with a move in SAP's approach to more inclusive preference agreement system methodology. So as you can see here, this is how the screen would appear in 10.0 and 10.1. So rather than making the screens agreement specific, they're now specific to the organizational units which are handling preference determination. So you see there's a drop down now for the admin unit, which would be your organizational unit that you're issuing or qualifying products for. And here I've inserted a drop down of what some admin units could look like. And the first selection that any user will make in this area is by the admin unit. So this is the first driving selection that will impact what preference functionality is available. And the admin units will be tied to the preference agreements that are valid for those admin units. So this is, I think, if you think about this change in the layout in terms of the multiple free trade agreements, it makes sense why they've changed this approach, because it's no longer an agreement-specific approach. It's really focused on, how and where you're qualifying, who's doing that qualification, and what preference agreements are tied to their products. And so they've taken a different approach and started the approach at what admin unit are you dealing with and what time period, and then going from there in terms of the products and vendors that are relevant for that admin unit. SAP GTS 10.0 can be set up with access through the NetWeaver Business Client, which presents GTS menus and functions in a web interface. We'll not be going into detail around the setup for the NetWeaver Business Client today, as outside the scope of this presentation. We at least wanted to highlight that this functionality is available and can be a valuable tool for preference maintenance. Also, as you can see from this view, that once you are within the LTVD maintenance or long-term vendor declaration maintenance transaction, the focus is running it by the admin unit and not by a particular preference agreement. Each admin unit now can have multiple preference agreements applied to it with a separate origin determination for each preference agreement. This screen is something that remains the same even within the NetWeaver Business Client. And while this has not changed, the fact is that within the screen you can see that you are running it for multiple free trade agreements for that product within that admin unit. And I'll show a better example later, but essentially this shows you that you have got two agreements here that you're running two different preference determinations for the same material. But I'll show you one later that has both a NAFTA and US-Korea determination on a bill of material, and you can probably see that a little bit more clearly. The long-term vendor declaration dashboard on the NetWeaver Business Client is also available, which can be a central point for managing vendor declaration requests and maintenance. The security over this maintenance can also be restricted so that users can only handle certain admin units and preference agreements. There's also a LTV dashboard report available in the web user interface. So SAP has provided some built-in reports that will show you responses for your LTVDs. You may want to develop additional reports to give you new views by preference agreements in case you want a greater level of granularity in your vendor declaration tracking. I'd say that this view is still fairly high level and doesn't really get you down to the detail where you may want to track by agreement and product, but at least it's the start of some standard reports in GTS for preference agreements. So starting in this release, the master data that belongs directly to a work area and preference processing is stored in that area. This makes it possible, for example, to use the assignment of a vendor to an admin unit as the relevant master data for processing vendor-based long-term vendor declarations. This merger of the master data and functions for the processes also applies to the master data and preference determination and for processing LTVDs for customer purposes. This slide again shows the transition from an agreement-based preference maintenance to having the admin units drive which preference agreements are being maintained. So you can see we moved beyond just managing by EU versus NAFTA in 8.0 and the earlier versions to just managing vendor declarations, and as we saw before, by the admin unit. So for that admin unit, you would activate which preference agreements are applicable, and that would be done in the configuration for preference processing. Prior to 10.0, GTS was limited to handling only EU and NAFTA. This was rather limiting and excluded opportunities for maintaining other preference agreements in GTS without significant enhancements. Now with the ability to handle multiple FTAs within GTS, this expands to include the results from various preference determination results, all using the same screen but now displaying individual results for the separate agreements. So you can see here, this is what we've now moved to, where we can have alternate preference rules that will look at different rule groups for a given item associated with that tariff, and you'll get down to the procedure as to what's relevant for that rule group. So whether it's a tariff shift, looking for some sort of RVC calculation, the calculation requirements do not need to be the same. So you can have less than or equal to 40% or greater than equal to 25% for the other, or they could require conditions. So now you can have an agreement by agreement qualification rather than just add a product level for within an admin unit. And you can see that the preference determination in GTS can be displayed for multiple agreements within the same admin unit. So you can see here, this is how the process, while it's remaining the same for vendor declaration maintenance, it now adds an additional layer where you can see the breakdown between agreements. So you can see here qualification for CAFTA versus NAFTA for a given product, and the aggregation has occurred, and you've got separate results. You can also maintain differing results. So, for example, here down below, you can one item could be not qualified and the other could be. With the introduction of other free trade agreements, the regional value content calculations are different and can vary from existing transaction value and net cost methods. The build-up and build-down methods are methods used on many of the recent FTAs and are now supported in GTS. The efficacy of the RVC calculation is largely dependent on the setup of your ECC bombs, so that won't change from whether you were managing preference in 8.0 or 7.2 to now. As you'll still need to make sure that what costs are captured in your bombs are correct and as they relate to preference determination. The bill of material is where the product's costs will be derived from, and you will need to ensure that the bombs are set up to capture or exclude the necessary costs for these methods. This is where some intelligent decisions by your, whether it's a project team or consultants around what bomb types and material types need to be made to ensure you're calculating based upon the right method. This likely will be an education for both your trade compliance, costing, and product master teams to ensure that all sides understand how the data flows and what items are actually being captured or should be captured to get the right value calculations. So the good news here is that GTS now supports additional RVC calculations. There may be some preference agreements, I'm thinking GSP that comes to mind, that may not necessarily fit into one of these methods, but this obviously does expand the scope of what NAFTA is able to support, what GTS is able to support beyond just NAFTA. So it has moved beyond just a simple RVC, net cost, transaction value method under previous 10.0, and now includes build-up and build-down methods, which are used in more of the recent free trade agreements, such as U.S.-Korea, for example. We also have the new web user interface for vendor declarations. So this process highlights how the web user interface could be used to capture vendor declarations from your supplier base. So you could have a customer request for a long-term vendor declaration be sent via email. So you, as the customer for the vendor, would send that. The supplier would maintain the vendor declaration in the GTS system via this web user interface application, so you'd have to set them up with some access to do that. And then the supplier commits the maintained LTVD. Optionally, they could be maintained, they could be printed off by the supplier. And then you, as the customer, can choose to accept the committed LTVD or not. So there's some functionality to put this into a provisional status, although you could, if you wanted to just log directly what your supplier wanted, you could have that post directly as a maintained status. So this is just meant to highlight some of the efficiencies that you can gain by integrating your suppliers closer into your trade compliance operations using GTS. So you can streamline the communications through emails directly from the system to notify your suppliers, and giving them access directly to maintain their responses. And you could still have controls over those responses by reviewing them and not fully accepting them and keeping them in a provisional status. And then once they've been reviewed, you could accept them, and then they could be used in your preference determination results. As you can see here, the web user interface looks very much like the standard GUI for long-term vendor declarations, and can generate a form to be emailed to the vendor with a link to maintain the vendor declaration. You'll need to ensure that if you're sending out emails from the system, then each of those email addresses will need to be maintained in the business partner records for those vendors. And then the vendor or someone in your organization will enter the vendor declaration responses. These responses are in a product-partner agreement combination. Once those are logged, the results should be aggregated at the product level to ensure that all sources of that material qualify before setting the preference status for that product master. And again, now with the support of multiple free trade agreements, that aggregation is not occurring just at a product master level, it's occurring at a product master agreement level. So it's going to look for that product master, do you have sources for each of those agreements? And so when you do that aggregation, you'll end up with results that indicate both. And here, if you wanted to ensure that you've got a check in the process where you as the customer to the supplier reviews the vendor declarations, you can use the functionality to transfer long-term vendor declarations and to commit those fully into the system. So you would run a transaction to transfer the long-term vendor declarations, review the ones that have been logged by the vendor, select the lines that you would want to transfer and accept, and confirm those transfers. And then this would update into the vendor declaration maintenance area in GTS. I'd like to get into a short business case demonstration about how the multiple free trade agreements can be supported from a preference qualification standpoint. And here we'll look at a product that is being manufactured in the U.S. and could be exported to either Mexico or Korea. And so we'll be looking at a NAFTA qualification as well as a U.S.-South Korea qualification. And so some implications here, and we won't go into transactions for each of these, but I at least wanted to call these out, is that you could involve long-term vendor declaration maintenance for both these agreements. So if you were going to establish inputs to these raw materials, inputs to these finished goods as qualified under one of these free trade agreements, you would have to go through the long-term vendor declaration maintenance for both those agreements for a single product. So while the process remains the same now with the support of multiple free trade agreements, it becomes, think of it as an iterative process. You now need to do it for each agreement which is going to impact that product. Now, if you don't do it for a particular agreement, it'll just say it's not qualified for that agreement, and it'll treat it as not originating. And you would have to try to qualify via other methods, maybe tariff shift or RVC, depending on the rule of origin for that product. But the source qualification now is done at an agreement level for that product. So if you're going to try to qualify the source, you need to have all the potential sources for that product qualified within that agreement. And then the preference qualification is done separately for both agreements. And while this is, the system is doing it separately itself, when you're actually running the transaction, you're doing it at a single product. So when you run it for a given product, it's going to check all the applicable preference agreements that are set up for your admin and unit. So it's going to look to see what preference can be set under each of those agreements and see if it can determine preference or if it should be set as non-originating. And then you would have to issue free trade agreement, FTA certificates of origin, such as NAFTA certificate of origin or other statements separately for both agreements, even if they are for the same customer. So you'll need to ensure that you've got separate forms mapped and laid out for those and issue those separately. And some of you may be familiar with this screen, but this is a view within the preference processing master data of a bill of product or a bill of material within GTS. So this shows for a given finished good, this 300-500, the aircraft landing assembly, all the inputs that are put into that assembly. So it's a fairly simple bill of material here. We've only got 4 inputs into it. It's not, I'm sure some manufacturers may have more complex ones with multi-level bill of materials. If that was true, they would show up here as well, and you could drill down. So you can see from here that some of the basic information has been maintained. So you do have which plants it's at, the quantities. We may want to look at the value here, but the values are maintained. Procurement indicators, are maintained, so we can tell whether it's externally procured or in-house production. Now, this is going to drive whether we need to maintain a vendor declaration from a supplier to actually qualify this, or whether we can self-qualify through our own qualification procedures. And then the tariff number, and this is a key input to the preference process. So this is a tariff number that exists for that admin unit. So it's going to be their tariff number that's set up for the U.S. for these items. And if we look at an associated rule of origin, such as within Korea, we can see that we can look up the preference rules of origin and see that for Korea, we've got several rules of origin that are applicable here. So this would be for 880320, and so we've got a specific one here. I won't show you. I believe it's a tariff shift rule. I don't have that screen to show you, but this is where you could drill down and look into that screen. And also here under NAFTA, you've got a separate rule as well. So you can see that the standard rules are different. And so this is where it's pulling from different rules when it's looking to the NAFTA qualification versus the South Korea qualification. Then when we get into the preference determination itself, this is where now you have the results for both agreements. So you see under the preference data, you've got two results, one for _DNAF and one _DUKR. So both preference agreements have gone through the preference determination for this bill of material. And unfortunately, our screenshot is cut off, but below you would see the components, and it would show the components being analyzed by both preference agreements. And this product itself qualified for a tariff shift, based on the tariff shift, and it was just at the 4-digit level. And then when you officially accept those results, obviously when you don't run it in simulation, those results are stored on the product master, and they would be listed by legal regulation or preference agreement. So you see here we've got NAFTA as well as the U.S.-South Korea trade agreement with results for both of those, the preference indicators, the plant model, the origin status. So and also if we wanted to pull up a detailed view, this is a detailed view of the NAFTA results. So showing the preference indicator B, plant group U.S., the non-origin value, although this qualified on a tariff shift analysis. So this is how you'll be able to maintain multiple free trade agreements. So if you maintain additional rule sets, you'll see additional results here, and if some are not qualifying versus some that are eligible, you'll see separate entries for each of those. So this is this could become quite a populated area depending on how many agreements you're maintaining, but it's definitely it's a change from what we experienced for 7.2 and earlier, or 8.0 and earlier, where you could really only have one result here. Now that covers our basic presentation. I think the key things that we wanted to communicate were that preference works largely the same as what you saw before. The system is now just more flexible, and it's more in tune with an approach that is not agreement focused, but on admin unit focused on who's actually doing the qualification and which agreements are relevant to them. And so now it's going to look to what agreements are available for that admin unit that can be qualified against. And so while the same transactions, I think we've seen improvements with the transactions that are used in various areas, and now they're more flexible to include additional agreements. The same process is going to be used from what we had in 8.0 and earlier in terms of using vendor declarations, running preference determination. Now it's just a little bit more flexible in terms of it can qualify at different levels with different agreement sets. So that's kind of the basic takeaway that we wanted to give people, that this is an area that has opened up opportunities for SAP GTS. There is being content that's maintained for these additional free trade agreements, and there's opportunity for us to start looking at how we can deploy additional free trade agreements within GTS that wasn't available to clients earlier, that can maybe provide some opportunities for your companies to leverage some efficiencies and gain some compliance advantages by having better controls over how your products are being qualified, and what free trade agreements certificates are being issued. So leaving it at that, I will open it up for any questions.
Jonathan, this is Holly. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have a question. You said if you have multiple free trade agreements, when you run qualification, it will run it for all of the free trade agreements that apply. What if you only want to run it for one and not all of them? How would you handle that?
You only wanted to run it for one of them. So that's something I could go back and see if there's any options for other transactions where you can do it for a single agreement. We've focused on where you can just qualify multiple agreements at a single time. It looks like it's running. In most cases, it's running across the board for all the agreements. You may need an enhancement to the system if there's not a transaction available that will do it on a single agreement basis.
Okay.
But I can look into that, and if I find something different, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have a question for the LTSD. For the LTSD, is there a way for vendors to also upload their signed certificate?
Well, if you had document management system enabled for GTS, you could probably log that as well as log the response. So I'd say it's a possibility. I think there would still be some rights of work that would have to be done to allow that, but it's certainly in line with opening this up for vendor maintenance. Is that the ability to insert documents or tie that to it as well. But I don't think there's anything necessarily right out of the box that would allow for that. But I think there's the components that are available in GTS to head down that path if that's where you wanted to go.
Okay. For clients that have never used the GTS STA system in the past, do you have services that can assist us on how to align our SAP information to support the GTS system?
Yeah, so I think as part of any implementation, we would want to look at how your ECC information is set up for your both your procured items as well as your manufactured items. And so we would work with you to identify if there's any gaps between how it's currently set up as well as what's needed for any preference determination based on the agreement. And that's where Entry Point can provide helpful expertise, given that we have got trade expertise with these various agreements, so we can give you guidance on what data elements are needed or not needed for complying with these free trade agreements.
Okay. Is the GTS ALADI agreement available for Latin American countries?
Is the question that are there free trade agreements available for Latin American countries?
Yes, it says the ALADI agreement.
I'm not familiar with that exact agreement, but I know that there are content vendors such as Customs Info that do maintain content, and they are looking at additional agreements such as that. So I can follow up with that and maybe post something to the ASUG group if we find out that there is that content currently available or in the pipeline. They are a partner with Entry Point as well, so we can find out that information rather quickly. But from a functionality perspective, this same setup can be used in other regions. These examples obviously were very U.S. focused, given my expectations of what the audience would be. But as long as the content is set up we could use content for other regions in the preference determination and run it for an agreement that was for, say, Mercosur or regions outside of North America. So while the content or the examples here were very North America specific, the same functionality can be used elsewhere, and we know of cases where it has been.
Hello, this is Manuel Lucio from Mexico. I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is, what happens if we request a certificate of origin by GTS and the harmonized code I use is different from the harmonized code that the vendor thinks that is the correct one?
So if your vendor has a different harmonized tariff code than what you're maintaining for that material?
That's right.
I don't think the system is going to be able to correct that for you. That's still, that's still going to require a process for you to work through with your vendor which tariff is correct, and if you're willing to accept both their tariff and their NAFTA or their free trade agreement certificate. I think that's probably a case where you may want to review that vendor declaration further, both internally and with the supplier before accepting it. But there's, certainly if you had the web user interface where the vendor was maintaining that, maybe we could work on setting up something that could flag in those cases where they've set it up something different than what you have it maintained internally. So you could be able to monitor for those situations.
Okay,
but if you didn't have that, I think you would have to have a business process where you look for those situations and have to coordinate with the vendor and your compliance people to come to the right determination.
Okay. Another question I have is what happens when the vendor has an external company that handles all the topics related with free trade agreements? GTS is allowed to accept, let's say, a third party that handles the certificate of origin of a vendor?
So if your vendor is maintaining for multiple free trade agreements, is that what you're asking?
No. My question is regarding that in my company we have some vendors that the vendor has another company, like a law firm or something like that they handle their certificate of origin. And when I contact the vendor send us with this third company. My question is what happened in those cases? I mean, if GTS is able to have the communication with this with this other company, the third party.
Yeah, if you were setting up your vendor to maintain that response in GTS, you could do that same setup with a third party, and so you could have, if you ran into that situation and they needed to have that third party access the system, then we could set it up so that they could get in and do that maintenance if that's what I think you're asking. So I don't see any issue there. That would just be a matter of getting them set up with the right access, as well as you may want to. I don't know if there would be any concerns around maybe making sure that they don't see certain data of the vendors. So you may have to work through some data segregation, but I think that shouldn't be a problem. It would just be a matter of the correct security setup.
Okay, thank you.
So this concludes our webcast for today. I would like to thank Holly Stein And Jonathan, our speakers for today, as mentioned earlier, the slides and recording link will be emailed to you and accessible on asug.com. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.